The sky split with a scream louder than war. On August 27, 1883, the island of Krakatoa tore itself apart. Not in silence, not in secrecy, but with a detonation so violent the world itself seemed to convulse. 2/3 of the island vanished in an instant, swallowed by the sea. The blast ripped across oceans, rattled barometers from London to New York, and carried a sound so deafening it traveled farther than any human voice had ever reached, heard 3,000 miles away, as if the earth itself had learned how to shout. Then came the waves. Black water rose like a moving wall, 40 meters high, faster than any ship, crueler than any storm. Whole coastlines disappeared, torn from the map. 36,000 lives extinguished in hours, their homes devoured, their villages erased, their names swept into the choking tide. But the terror did not end with the drowning. Ash, fine as death's breath, wrapped the globe in a shroud. Sunsets burned crimson for months. Skies bled colors no artist had ever seen. The planet dimmed, chilled, silenced. Crops failed. Traders vanished. Shipping lanes clogged with endless rafts of floating pumice. The wreckage of a world rewritten. Krakatoa was no eruption. It was an execution, delivered by the earth itself. Krakatoa stood in the middle of the Sunda Strait, a strip of water between Java and Sumatra that served as one of the most vital arteries of 19th century trade. This was no isolated rock, no nameless fragment of land. It was a volcanic giant born of fire, a product of the Earth's most violent forces, and it sat astride a shipping lane that carried spices, tin, coffee, and the wealth of empires. The Sunda Strait was not simply a passage. It was a gate between the Indian Ocean and the Java Sea, a corridor connecting the West to the treasures of the East. Every vessel that braved its currents passed within sight of Krakatoa, and every captain knew the mountain could not be trusted, for it belonged to the Pacific Ring of Fire, the restless circle where tectonic plates collide and volcanoes are never still. The island itself was deceptive in its beauty, covered in dense jungle, rising steeply from the sea, its peak reaching over 800 meters. But beneath the trees and ridges lay magma chambers forged by subduction, where the Indo-Australian plate forced itself under the Eurasian plate. This relentless grinding and melting, unseen beneath the waves, produced the molten reservoirs that gave birth to Krakatoa. Its history was written in layers of lava and ash, each eruption stacking upon the last, a geological chronicle of violence stretching back thousands of years. To sailors, it was a landmark. To scientists, it was a subject of speculation. To those who lived on Java and Sumatra, it was a fire mountain, an unpredictable force whose anger was older than memory itself. The records spoke of earlier convulsions. One eruption, said to have occurred in 416 AD, was described in Javanese chronicles. That event tore the mountain apart, collapsing much of its structure into the sea, leaving behind 3 smaller islands around the caldera's rim. The Javanese texts claimed that the mountain of Kapi erupted with such ferocity that it split apart, its fragments swallowed by the sea, and that the violent waves which followed devastated surrounding coastlines. Though modern volcanologists debate the details, the story reflects a truth. Krakatoa had destroyed itself before, and it was capable of doing so again. Centuries later, in 1680, Krakatoa returned to life. Dutch records, along with local oral traditions, tell of an eruption so powerful it darkened skies over the Sunda Strait for days. The colonial presence in the region was still strengthening then, but Dutch officials recognized the peril, noting with unease that entire villages were covered in ash, forests flattened, and skies filled with choking fumes. Ships passing through reported pumice rafts drifting for miles, a sign that fire beneath the sea was as dangerous as the mountain above it. The eruption of the 1680s eventually subsided, but it was a warning written in black smoke across the horizon. Krakatoa had only been waiting. For the people of Java and Sumatra, these eruptions were not simply natural disasters. They were signs. Myths grew around the fire mountains. In local lore, volcanoes were the abodes of spirits, their eruptions messages from powers greater than kings or colonizers. Eruptions were not random. They carried meaning, warnings, punishments. Communities near Krakatoa lived with this tension, cultivating fertile volcanic soils while never forgetting that the same mountain that fed them could also erase them. The Sunda Straits villages, fishing settlements, and ports bore this duality every day. By the 19th century, the Sunda Strait had become one of the most important maritime crossroads of empire. Dutch colonial rule turned Java into the crown jewel of the East Indies, a land of immense agricultural wealth. Ships carrying sugar, coffee, pepper, and quinine sailed through the strait, bound for Europe, while others arrived carrying textiles, weapons, and manufactured goods. British, French, and Dutch traders all competed for dominance along this passage, and steamships joined sailing vessels in constant movement between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. To navigate the strait was to pass Krakatoa itself. The mountain loomed as both guide and threat, its profile etched against the horizon, its silence never fully trusted. Mariners recorded steam vents, faint tremors, and occasional plumes rising from its peak in the years before 1883. They did not dismiss them. Experienced sailors understood what such signs could mean, even if they did not grasp the magnitude of what the Earth was preparing. Geographically, Krakatoa was not one island, but a cluster. By the early 19th century, three main volcanic peaks rose from the caldera's remnants: Purbawaitan to the north, Danan in the center, and Rakata to the south. Together, they formed a rough triangle of land measuring about 9 kilometers across. Each cone was part of the same volcanic system, fed by the same magma chamber beneath. Rakata was the tallest, a rugged mountain rising over 800 meters, while Purbawaitan and Danan were slightly lower, but no less volatile. Dense forests covered their slopes, and birds and animals thrived where lava had once flowed. Yet these cones were like pressure valves, their silence not a sign of peace, but of energy building below. For centuries, Krakatoa's position between Java and Sumatra also made it a point of control. Whoever commanded the Sunda Strait held influence over one of the key routes of global trade. Long before the Dutch, the Srivijaya Empire and later the Sultanates of Banten and Palembang had looked upon the strait as a prize. The Dutch seized it not only for its economic importance, but for its geography. They built fortifications and stationed ships, knowing this was a choke point through which the wealth of Asia flowed. Every eruption of Krakatoa was therefore not just a natural event, but a disruption to the arteries of empire. In the decades leading to 1883, Krakatoa gave subtle warnings. Minor eruptions occurred sporadically. The northern cone, Purbawaitan, produced small explosions in the early 1800s, though they caused little damage. Dutch colonial administrators noted them, but with indifference. Ashfalls were seen on nearby islands, steam rose from vents, but life resumed quickly. Traders and colonial authorities alike grew accustomed to Krakatoa's rumblings, treating them as background noise to the rhythm of commerce. What they did not realize was that these small events were preludes, signs of pressure accumulating in a magma chamber that had not fully released its fury for 2 centuries. The Sunda Strait itself was a landscape shaped by geology as much as by empire. Beneath its waters, volcanic ridges and trenches revealed the violence of tectonic collisions. The strait's currents were treacherous, shifting with monsoons, carrying silt, pumice, and volcanic debris. Earthquakes were common. To those who knew the region, Krakatoa was simply one part of this volatile world, but its size and history made it the most feared. The 416 AD eruption had already proven it could dismantle itself entirely, creating tsunamis that swept across the strait. That memory lived on in chronicles and folklore. The 1680 eruption had demonstrated that such destruction was not confined to ancient history. And yet, as the 19th century moved forward, as shipping increased and colonial control deepened, Krakatoa was again written off as silent. It was not silent. It was waiting. The Dutch East Indies in the 19th century was an empire within an empire, a jewel claimed by the Netherlands, yet paid for with the sweat, blood, and submission of millions across Java, Sumatra, and the countless islands that formed the archipelago. The land was vast, rich, and strategically indispensable. By the 1800s, the Dutch had transformed these islands into one of the most lucrative colonies in the world, controlling spices that once dictated European trade routes, monopolizing coffee and sugar plantations that fueled European markets, and extracting tin that fed the machinery of the industrial age. Every ship passing between the Indian Ocean and the Java Sea through the Sunda Strait was part of this machine. And at the center of that strait, silent and looming, stood Krakatoa. The Sunda Strait was more than a stretch of water. It was a lifeline of empire. British, French, and Dutch merchants recognized its value. Whoever commanded it, commanded the movement of goods between the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. The Dutch held the choke point firmly, fortified by naval power and administrative control. They taxed ships, controlled ports, and monitored coastal settlements. Yet this empire, outwardly so strong, was more fragile than it appeared. Beneath its order, it depended on the land's unpredictable forces, monsoons, shifting seas, and mountains that breathed fire. The Dutch could master trade routes, but they could not master the earth beneath them. Krakatoa was no idle threat in their domain. Its past eruptions in 416 AD and 1680 lingered in records, Dutch administrators noting it in the same matter-of-fact tone they used for taxation. But the volcano's potential was underestimated. By the late 19th century, most colonial authorities viewed the mountains as background features, important for navigation and occasionally troublesome with ash or tremors, but not existential dangers. Yet those who lived along Java's and Sumatra's coasts, the Javanese and the Sundanese, carried different knowledge. To them, fire mountains were sacred and feared. They were living beings capable of wrath, their eruptions woven into myths and histories. Every tremor, every hiss of steam, every plume of smoke was not merely a geological event, but a message, an omen from forces larger than themselves. In May 1883, the mountain began to stir. It started quietly, with unusual seismic activity felt along the Sunda Strait. On May 20th, ships navigating the waters between Java and Sumatra reported columns of ash rising from Krakatoa's northern cone, Purbawaitan. The ash climbed hundreds of meters into the air, blackening the sky around the island. By May 22nd, Dutch colonial records noted that explosions were heard in Batavia, nearly 150 kilometers away, though faint and intermittent. The mountain had begun a new phase of activity. Steam vents hissed from its slopes. Explosions followed one after another, building in rhythm like a drumbeat. On nearby islands, settlers described the sound as gunfire, rolling across the water. By May 26th, the ash plume reached heights of nearly 11 kilometers, visible from great distances. Ships reported that the surface of the sea was covered with floating pumice, drifting across the strait in wide bands. Sailors navigating through it found their vessels slowed by the thick rafts of volcanic rock, a warning that something immense was shifting beneath the waves. For the Dutch authorities in Batavia, the events were troubling but not unprecedented. The Indies had no shortage of volcanic eruptions, from Merapi in central Java to Tambora on Sumbawa, which in 1815 had caused the deadliest eruption in recorded history. Krakatoa's outbursts in May 1883 seemed minor in comparison, violent but not yet catastrophic. Officials monitored reports, ships carried word of conditions, but commerce continued. Plantations harvested coffee and sugar, ports bustled with trade, steamships passed through the Sunda Strait. To the colonial administrators, it was another eruption among many. To the local villagers, the signs were impossible to ignore. Coastal communities near the Sunda Strait began to interpret the mountain's anger in their own ways. Fishermen whispered of spirits awakening. Farmers saw ash fall on their crops and feared that the mountain was signaling destruction. Oral traditions described how fire mountains warned before they destroyed, and the warnings were now unmistakable. Yet even as anxiety spread across villages, life had to continue. The fertile soil of Java, enriched by centuries of volcanic ash, was too valuable to abandon. Families worked their fields, traders carried goods across the strait, fishermen cast their nets, all while the mountain growled in the background. The contrast was stark. On one side, an empire running on timetables, taxes, and trade, convinced that order was permanent. On the other, local populations whose histories stretched back before Dutch conquest, who knew that order was temporary when the earth itself was the master. The Dutch recorded explosions in their logbooks. The Javanese spoke of omens in their stories. Both were correct, but only one felt the full weight of fear. In the weeks that followed, Krakatoa did not settle. Instead, it grew louder. Minor eruptions continued into June, venting ash and steam, shaking the ground beneath the Sunda Strait. Ships continued to report falling ash and pumice, covering decks in gray dust. Mariners sailing nearby described the air as heavy, the sea around the island littered with floating debris. The sound of detonations echoed across the strait with greater force, growing too frequent to ignore. The island was alive, restless, its silence broken after 2 centuries of uneasy waiting. All of this unfolded within a world balanced on fragile power. The Dutch East Indies was not isolated. Every eruption was watched by traders, missionaries, and colonial officers whose reports traveled to Europe, where decisions were made in boardrooms and parliaments far from the choking ash and trembling ground. The wealth of the Indies filled Dutch coffers, but those profits depended on stable routes, predictable harvests, and uninterrupted movement across the seas. Krakatoa, stirring violently in May 1883, threatened to disrupt all of it. The empire, vast as it seemed, stood on foundations that could be shaken not by armies or rebellions, but by a mountain erupting in the middle of its most important maritime passage. The signs were there: ash clouds climbing into the atmosphere, pumice drifting for miles, explosions heard across provinces, tremors felt along coastlines. The earth was shifting beneath the Sunda Strait, and both colonizers and colonized knew it. The difference lay in interpretation. The Dutch calculated disruption to trade. The locals sensed disaster on a scale no trade ledger could measure. Both were watching a mountain that would not wait much longer. By the summer of 1883, Krakatoa was no longer the silent landmark it had once been. The eruptions that began in May had not ceased. They had multiplied, intensifying in frequency and force as the weeks passed. What had started as intermittent explosions and drifting pumice became a constant roar from beneath the sea. Through June, July, and into August, the island was alive with fury. Columns of ash rose from its northern cone, shooting thousands of meters into the air, visible to ships navigating the Sunda Strait and settlements lining the coasts of Java and Sumatra. Each eruption grew higher. Each detonation carried farther. Each tremor shook the earth more violently than before. The mountain was building towards something larger, something no one could yet comprehend. Eyewitnesses described the sight with fear and precision. From the decks of passing vessels, sailors saw Krakatoa enveloped in towering columns of ash, shot through with fire. Volcanic lightning, a product of friction within the ash clouds, flashed continuously above the island, illuminating the night sky in bursts that rivaled cannon fire. Dutch officials stationed in the colonies reported detonations so loud they were mistaken for naval gunfire. Residents on Java and Sumatra lived beneath skies that darkened without warning, blanketed by ash carried on shifting winds. The air grew heavy with sulfur, sharp and suffocating, while pumice rained down, covering fields and floating in the sea in endless gray sheets. Ships navigating the strait were caught in conditions that seemed almost impossible for human endurance. On board the German warship Elba, officers recorded how ash descended in such density that the crew struggled to breathe. The surface of the sea, usually a mirror of the monsoon winds, was littered with pumice stones large enough to strike hulls, slowing vessels as though they were cutting through fields of ice. Dutch traders, British steamers, and native fishing boats alike reported the same ordeal: an ocean choked with volcanic debris and a sky charged with ash and lightning. As August advanced, the eruptions accelerated further. The most active of the 3 volcanic cones, erupted continuously, its blasts sending shockwaves across the strait. Dainen and Krakatoa, the other 2 peaks, began to join in, their own vents opening with fury. Together, the 3 cones roared like a chorus of cannon. By August 24th, explosions were occurring almost every 10 minutes, the ground shaking with each detonation. Entire days passed under an atmosphere of ashfall, villages coated in layers that turned crops gray and poisoned reservoirs. The smell of sulfur clung to every settlement within sight of the island. The violence was not confined to the island itself. The sea around Krakatoa was transformed into a boiling surface of floating debris. Sailors recorded pumice stones the size of fists, clashing against their hulls with each wave. The Dutch steamer Loudon, under the command of Captain Lindemann, reported sailing through a sea so thick with pumice that the ship nearly stalled. The air was filled with choking ash, forcing passengers to cover their faces with cloths soaked in seawater. Every witness sensed the mountain's unrest was approaching its breaking point. On August 25th, the tempo of the eruptions rose again. Reports reached Batavia of explosions audible across hundreds of kilometers. Villagers in western Java and southern Sumatra spoke of constant thunder from the sea, a noise that did not fade but only grew stronger. The volcano seemed to pulse, each eruption larger than the one before, as though the earth itself was straining under pressure that could no longer be contained. By the early hours of August 26th, the mountain had entered a phase of near-constant eruption, each blast hurling ash and rock kilometers into the air. That afternoon, the violence escalated into something unprecedented. Eyewitnesses on Java described seeing an ash column rise more than 25 kilometers high, blotting out the sun. The plume was so vast that it generated its own weather systems, with lightning storms raging inside the cloud, bolts flashing in rapid succession as the ash particles collided. Ships navigating the Sunda Strait at that time reported total darkness, as if night had fallen in the middle of the day. Ash fell so heavily that lamps were needed even in broad daylight. Some vessels were forced to turn back, unable to continue through the choking atmosphere. By evening, Krakatoa was no longer a volcano producing eruptions. It had become a continuous detonation, a chain of explosions that merged into an unbroken roar. The ground shook violently across the region, houses rattling in Batavia, more than 150 kilometers away. In the villages nearest the strait, walls cracked, roofs collapsed under the weight of falling ash, and the air carried an unrelenting rumble that unnerved even the most seasoned inhabitants of Java's volcanic landscapes. The evening sky glowed red with fire from the island, visible to those on Sumatra's western shore, who watched in terror as the mountain belched fire, smoke, and molten rock into the sea. Eyewitnesses spoke of an island that seemed to be tearing itself apart. Entire sections of Krakatoa collapsed into the water, sending surges of displaced sea racing outward. Sailors navigating the strait reported sudden, violent swells, waves rising without warning and crashing against their vessels in confusion. The sea itself seemed unstable, restless, whipped into motion by forces far beyond the wind. Some accounts described shockwaves passing through the water, hammering hulls with invisible force. That night, August 26th, marked the beginning of Krakatoa's most violent phase. The eruptions intensified beyond anything recorded in living memory. Continuous detonations, volcanic lightning storms, a sea clogged with pumice, ash clouds that spread hundreds of kilometers, all pointed to a cataclysm that was still building. The mountain's fury was not yet at its peak. Krakatoa had entered a stage where every tremor, every blast, every surge of ash was driving toward a climax that would tear through the strait and send shockwaves across the globe. The world around it was already reeling, yet the true scale of what was coming had not yet revealed itself. At dawn on August 27, 1883, the world entered the most violent hours of volcanic history. Krakatoa, which had raged through the previous night, now reached the breaking point. At 5:30 in the morning, the first of 4 colossal explosions tore through the Sunda Strait. The sound was unlike anything known to human memory, a detonation so fierce that it ruptured eardrums of those standing within miles, killed sailors on nearby ships outright, and sent shockwaves racing across the seas. The German warship Elba, anchored some distance away, recorded the blast as a cannonade beyond comprehension. Within minutes, a column of ash surged nearly 25 kilometers into the stratosphere, blotting out the sky. But this was only the beginning. At 6:44 a.m., the second explosion ripped through the island, stronger than the first. Entire sections of Krakatoa's northern cone collapsed into the sea, displacing enormous volumes of water. The force generated waves that raced outward at terrifying speeds. Settlements on the coasts of Java and Sumatra were hit within minutes. Villagers fled inland as the sea rose against them, but the waves were faster than their escape. Ships caught in the strait were thrown against each other, hulls shattered as if struck by unseen hands. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the force of the eruption. Ash fell in choking torrents, smothering crops, rooftops, and harbors. At 8:20 a.m., the third explosion followed. This blast sent ash and pumice higher than any eruption yet seen, soaring nearly 40 kilometers above the earth. Lightning storms raged within the rising column, bolts flashing across a sky already blackened with ash. Those on Java's western coast described hearing detonations so loud that houses collapsed from the force of the sound alone. The town of Merak, facing Krakatoa across the strait, was almost instantly obliterated by walls of water that followed the explosion. Thousands of lives were erased in minutes. The final eruption came at 10:02 a.m. This was not just an explosion. It was a detonation so violent it destroyed 2/3 of the island in an instant. The northern two cones, Perbo-Waitan and Danan, vanished into the sea as the caldera collapsed, leaving only the southern peak of Krakatoa standing, half-shorn and fractured. The volume of the blast defies measurement. Scientists later estimated its power at over 200 megatons of TNT, 4 times more powerful than the most destructive hydrogen bomb ever tested. The explosion was heard across nearly 3,000 miles of ocean, reaching as far as Perth in Western Australia and the island of Rodriguez near Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. At that distance, it was still perceived as cannon fire or distant gunshots. Nowhere else in history has a sound carried so far. The shockwave did not stop at the horizon. Barometers worldwide recorded its passage as it circled the globe. In Calcutta, in St. Petersburg, in London, instruments marked sudden rises and falls in air pressure. The wave traveled around the earth not once, but 7 times, an echo that would not die, a reminder of the violence unleashed in the Sunda Strait. Meteorological stations, from the Dutch East Indies to Europe, documented the phenomenon with precision. The atmosphere itself had been punched by the force of Krakatoa. On the seas surrounding the island, ships bore witness to devastation beyond comprehension. The Dutch steamer Loudon, commanded by Captain Lindeman, barely survived the morning. Waves lifted the vessel like a toy, while ash rained down in such thickness that the crew was forced to sweep the decks constantly to prevent the weight from capsizing the ship. Passengers choked on sulfurous gases and were blinded by ash storms, some praying aloud as explosions cracked like the end of the world. The ship survived, but many others did not. Entire fleets of smaller craft vanished without trace, swallowed by waves or buried in pumice rafts. On land, the destruction was merciless. Villages on both sides of the Sunda Strait were wiped away in moments. In Ketembang, on Sumatra's coast, entire communities were obliterated, their existence erased without warning. In Anjer, a once thriving port in western Java, waves generated by the final blast struck with such force that the town ceased to exist. Survivors spoke of walls of water 30 to 40 meters high, surging inland, tearing apart forests, houses, and human life with unstoppable violence. The death toll rose rapidly, not from lava or ash alone, but from the sea unleashed by Krakatoa's collapse. Those who survived described the sound as unbearable, a constant bombardment that split the air and hammered the body. Eardrums burst as far as 40 miles from the island. People staggered under the shock waves, knocked down by the force of invisible pressure. Ash darkened the region for hundreds of kilometers, turning day into night. For hours, the Sunda Strait became unrecognizable, an ocean of pumice, shattered forests, and drifting corpses. By the time the eruption subsided later that day, Krakatoa itself was no longer the same island. 2/3 of its mass had disappeared. Where mountains once stood, there was now sea, a vast caldera filled with boiling water and drifting debris. Only the southern remnant of Krakatoa remained, jagged and broken, standing as a monument to the violence that had erased its companions. The earth had been shaken in a way no one had witnessed before. The explosions of August 27, 1883, had not been confined to the Sunda Strait. They had reached across oceans, across continents, into instruments and memories far beyond Java and Sumatra. Krakatoa's detonation was no local disaster. It was a planetary event, a rupture so vast that the entire world felt its echo. The eruptions of August 27, 1883, were not only an assault of fire and ash. they unleashed the sea itself. When Krakatoa's caldera collapsed in the late morning, the very foundations of the island sank into the Sunda Strait. Thousands of cubic meters of rock and magma were swallowed by the ocean in an instant, displacing unimaginable volumes of water. The sea had no choice but to rise, and when it did, it rose with fury. Tsunamis surged outward from the site of destruction, waves that would become the true killers of the day. The mechanics of their birth were violent. Each explosion tore sections of the island apart, hurling them into the sea. The collapse of Krakatoa's northern cone created an immense void, and the ocean rushed in, surging against the forces beneath. Pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of ash, gas, and volcanic rock raced across the water surface at more than 100 kilometers per hour. Though they should have sunk, the density of the hot clouds kept them buoyant, skimming over the sea before plunging into it. Each time they collapsed into the strait, they generated waves that spread like ripples on a colossal scale. Some reached heights of 30 to 40 meters, walls of water moving at speeds too great for flight or escape. The coasts of Java and Sumatra bore the full impact. At the port town of Anjer on Java's western edge, the morning's calm was obliterated by the first great wave. At approximately 10:30 a.m., following the final eruption, the sea withdrew for a brief, deceptive moment. Then it returned as a mountain of water. Ships anchored in the harbor were carried inland like driftwood, smashing into buildings before being dragged back into the receding tide. The Dutch lighthouse at Anjer, a proud structure meant to guide sailors through the treacherous strait, was ripped from its foundations. Not a trace of the town remained afterward. Across the water, Sumatra's coast was no safer. In Ketembang, villages were engulfed within minutes. Eyewitnesses who survived described the wave as towering higher than coconut palms, sweeping away entire communities. Wooden houses disintegrated under its force, livestock vanished, and people were torn from the ground as if weightless. Survivors clung to treetops or debris, but few managed to hold on as the sea carried them back out again. The statistics recorded afterward convey the enormity of the destruction. Over 36,000 people perished, though many scholars believe the true figure may have been higher. Some contemporary reports suggested casualties closer to 50,000, with remote settlements erased so thoroughly that their losses could never be counted. The Dutch colonial administration documented the devastation with precision, but the numbers were still only estimates against a backdrop of incomprehensible ruin. Tidal waves up to 40 meters in height left scars that reshaped the coastlines of the Sunda Strait permanently. On Java's coast, entire inlets disappeared while new lagoons were carved where villages had stood. Sandbanks shifted, rivers found new paths to the sea, and fertile farmland was buried beneath thick layers of pumice and saltwater. On Sumatra, stretches of shoreline simply ceased to exist, ground swallowed by the ocean and replaced with barren flats. The geography of the strait was rewritten in a single day. The force of the waves was recorded far beyond Indonesia. In the Indian Ocean, unusual sea surges reached the coasts of Sri Lanka and India. Hours later, tidal disturbances were detected in the Arabian Peninsula. Across the Pacific, instruments registered the passage of Krakatoa's tsunamis, their energy dissipating yet still noticeable as far as the Americas. Few natural disasters had ever sent such far-reaching signals across the oceans. First-hand accounts preserve the human cost in chilling detail. The crew of the Dutch steamship Loudon, already battered by the eruption, later reported seeing entire villages swept away as their vessel fought to stay afloat. Captain Lindemann described the waves rising like mountains, threatening to capsize the ship at every moment. Ash and pumice covered the sea so thickly that the water resembled land, and dead bodies floated among the debris, carried by currents that no one could resist. In Lampung, Sumatra, survivors recalled the ground trembling before the sea struck. Some thought another eruption was underway, but the real terror came in the form of a massive wall of water. Within minutes, thousands were gone, their settlements buried under debris and salt. Those who attempted to flee inland were pursued by wave after wave. Unlike earthquakes, which often strike once and recede, Krakatoa's tsunamis arrived in successive surges, each one powerful enough to erase whatever had survived the previous assault. The destruction was not only immediate, but lasting. Fields along the coasts were poisoned by seawater, turning once productive farmland into wastelands. Entire communities that had thrived on fishing and trade were annihilated. Survivors faced not only the trauma of loss, but the collapse of their way of life. Harbors that had anchored the Dutch East Indies trade with the wider world were obliterated, their piers shattered, their warehouses swept away. Commerce halted, communication broke down, and the region's economy was left in ruins. What made Krakatoa's tsunamis uniquely devastating was their speed and unpredictability. Unlike tsunamis caused by earthquakes, which begin with a sudden shift in the seafloor, these waves were born from collapsing calderas and searing pyroclastic surges. They struck with little warning, giving coastal towns no time to evacuate. Reports told of people running inland only to find the waves racing faster than their legs could carry them. In some places, the sea advanced kilometers inland, leaving devastation in its wake. The Dutch colonial government attempted to measure and document the event in the aftermath. Surveyors mapped the new coastlines, recorded depths of inundation, and estimated casualties with a meticulousness that spoke to both bureaucratic precision and human shock. They found villages erased so completely that only the foundations of stone buildings hinted that communities had once existed there. The Sunda Strait itself was forever altered. Krakatoa's collapse created a vast underwater caldera, and the waves that followed carved new scars across the seafloor. Where once lay predictable channels for navigation, sailors now faced hidden shoals and new hazards. For decades, maps of the region bore marks of the disaster, warnings of the changes wrought in hours by the ocean's unleashed force. Even for those who never saw the waves, the psychological impact endured. News of the disaster spread rapidly through the colonial press. Reports of entire coastlines swept away reached Batavia, Singapore, Calcutta, and eventually Europe. The sheer scale of the death toll stunned the world. For many, the thought that a volcano could erase tens of thousands in a single day, not with fire but with water, was almost beyond comprehension. The tsunamis of August 27, 1883, were not separate from the eruption. They were its deadliest legacy. Generated by collapsing calderas and collapsing flows of fire into the sea, they carried destruction farther than ash or lava ever could. In their passage, they obliterated towns, erased coastlines, and claimed tens of thousands of lives. The survivors bore witness to one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history, an event where sea and fire conspired to reshape the earth. On the morning of August 27, 1883, as the final explosion of Krakatoa tore through the Sunda Strait, an immense column of volcanic ash surged skyward. It did not merely rise above the island. It pierced the very limits of the atmosphere. Estimates place its height at nearly 50 miles, reaching the stratosphere, a level rarely disturbed by earthly forces. Within hours, particles of pulverized rock, glassy shards of volcanic ash, and sulfur-rich gases began spreading outward, carried by high-altitude winds that knew no boundaries of nation or sea. The eruption that had already drowned coasts and shattered islands now took possession of the sky itself. The immediate consequence was suffocation across the archipelago. For days, the skies above Java and Sumatra disappeared into a blackness so dense that eyewitnesses compared midday to midnight. Ships navigating the strait reported being trapped in darkness where lamps could barely cut through the ash-laden air. Ash fell in thick blankets, clogging rivers, flattening crops, and smothering villages already devastated by waves. But what unfolded next was not confined to Indonesia. Krakatoa's eruption was not a regional disaster. It was a global event. By September 1883, within only a few weeks of the explosion, fine particles from the eruption had encircled the Earth. These aerosols, suspended high in the atmosphere, scattered and refracted sunlight in unusual ways. Across Asia, the Pacific, and far into Europe, sunsets transformed into extraordinary displays of crimson, orange, and violet, lingering longer than anyone had seen before. In London, artists recorded fiery skies over the Thames that seemed too unreal to be natural. Painters like William Ashcroft filled sketchbooks with dozens of studies of glowing twilight skies. Newspapers in Europe described evenings so unnaturally red that many mistook them for distant fires burning on the horizon. In America, observers noted the same phenomenon. The New York Times recorded the strange effects of volcanic twilight, describing the sun sinking beneath a haze that left streaks of purple and scarlet across the heavens. The phenomenon persisted for months, returning again and again with a brilliance that could not be ignored. The stratospheric veil of dust and gas was global in reach, scattering light across thousands of miles. Even in far-off places like the Caribbean and South America, skies bore the mark of Krakatoa's violence. The eruption also imprinted itself upon science. For the first time, meteorologists, astronomers, and natural philosophers systematically studied the global spread of volcanic aerosols. In Europe, the Royal Society collected reports from around the world, compiling observations of sky color, weather anomalies, and atmospheric optics. Luminous halos formed around the moon, strange coronae encircled the sun, and brilliant beams of light known as bishop's rings appeared in the sky, named after Reverend Sereno Bishop of Hawaii, who described them in late 1883. These visual disturbances confirmed what the scientific community was beginning to understand. Volcanic eruptions of this scale were not isolated disasters, but drivers of planetary climate. Indeed, the climate shifted. By 1884, the Earth's average temperature had fallen by nearly 1.2 degrees Celsius. That decline was not evenly distributed. Regions across the northern hemisphere reported unusually cold winters and shorter growing seasons. In parts of North America and Europe, frost appeared in months when it should not have. Crops failed in certain areas, harvests shrank, and food prices rose. While the changes were not as catastrophic as the famines caused by the eruption of Tambora in 1815, the atmospheric effects of Krakatoa were still profoundly felt in both economy and society. Beyond the skies and climate, the oceans themselves bore evidence of the eruption's far-reaching aftermath. Pumice, formed as frothy lava solidified instantly upon contact with seawater, began to drift across the region. Vast floating rafts of this lightweight volcanic rock, some stretching for miles, clogged shipping lanes in the Indian Ocean. Vessels navigating routes between Batavia, Singapore, and beyond encountered seas covered in gray, porous stone. Sailors reported ships slowed or even temporarily trapped as the pumice gathered around their hulls. These rafts did not disperse quickly. They traveled with ocean currents for months, eventually reaching coastlines as far away as Zanzibar and Madagascar. The persistence of these pumice fields disrupted trade at a time when maritime shipping was vital for colonial economies. The Sunda Strait had long been a critical artery for Dutch and British commerce, linking the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. After Krakatoa, navigation through these waters became treacherous, not only from the pumice but also from the altered geography of the strait itself. Entire sections of coastline had been redrawn, channels filled with new volcanic debris, and shoals made hazardous for vessels dependent on precise charts. The skies, however, remained the most striking witness to the eruption's global scope. Reports of spectacular sunsets continued through 1884 and even into 1885 in certain regions. Artists, scientists, and the public alike struggled to comprehend the longevity of the phenomenon. Some linked the strange skies to religious or supernatural causes, interpreting them as omens. But the emerging field of atmospheric science provided another explanation. The ash and sulfur dioxide injected into the stratosphere had created a long-lived haze, one that gradually settled, but only after reshaping how humanity thought about volcanic eruptions and their planetary consequences. The scale of Krakatoa's atmospheric reach cannot be overstated. Never before had humanity documented with such precision the global fingerprint of a volcanic event. The data collected from 1883 onward became foundational for understanding the links between volcanism and climate. Later generations of scientists would look back at Krakatoa as a turning point, an early case study in how Earth's natural forces can instantaneously alter both the environment and human society far beyond the immediate site of the catastrophe. In every part of the globe, from the glowing skies of Europe to the disrupted trade routes of Asia, Krakatoa's ash left a reminder. The Earth's atmosphere and oceans are shared, connected, and vulnerable to forces far beyond human control. The explosion had shattered an island, drowned thousands in waves, but its most enduring legacy drifted silently, invisibly, above the world. Particles suspended in air, scattering light, bending climate, and leaving an imprint that no one alive at the time could forget. When the sound of Krakatoa's fury finally faded on August 27, 1883, the world stood in stunned silence. What remained was not an island as maps once showed, but a scarred, broken landscape. Coastlines scoured bare, settlements turned to skeletons of rubble, and seas choked with drifting pumice. The Sunda Strait, once a thriving corridor of trade between Sumatra and Java, became an unrecognizable graveyard of wreckage and shifting waters. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the weight of devastation, measured in absence. Villages erased, families unaccounted for, and entire stretches of land depopulated. The Dutch colonial administration, rulers of the East Indies at the time, were left to face a disaster of a scale no government had prepared for. Relief efforts were chaotic, stretched beyond capacity. Local garrisons and officials attempted to provide food, medical aid, and shelter, but the sheer magnitude of loss overwhelmed them. Tens of thousands had perished in the tsunamis, while survivors, stripped of homes and livelihoods, faced hunger and disease in the weeks that followed. The coastlines of western Java and southern Sumatra, once dotted with thriving villages, plantations, and bustling harbors, now lay eerily quiet. Entire communities vanished overnight. The fertile lands were buried under layers of volcanic debris, turning once productive fields into wastelands. The Sunda Strait, a vital artery of colonial commerce, had become perilous, not only because of its treacherous waters clogged with pumice and altered currents, but because the very geography had been rewritten. Cartographers were forced to redraw their charts. Over two-thirds of Krakatoa had disappeared beneath the sea, and in its place yawned a vast submerged caldera nearly 7 kilometers across. Where ships once sailed familiar routes, captains now found themselves navigating uncertain waters. The seafloor had been violently rearranged, creating hidden shoals and unpredictable channels. Shipping routes that had been central to Dutch colonial trade were forced to shift, and the strait's reputation as a dangerous passage grew. 4 years after the eruption, reports came in of pumice rafts, masses of floating rock, some stretching for miles, clogging the seas and delaying trade. Vessels sailing between Batavia, Singapore, and ports further west carried with them the scars of a disaster that had reached far beyond local shores. In Europe, where the Netherlands depended heavily on the economic output of its colony, the catastrophe highlighted the fragility of empire. Java and Sumatra, jewels of the Dutch East Indies, had suffered losses not only in human life, but also in infrastructure critical to trade and governance. Plantations were destroyed, harbors crippled, and inland roads cut off by the obliteration of coastal towns. Relief operations were not just humanitarian, but also economic measures to keep the machinery of empire from grinding to a halt. Yet, despite their efforts, the devastation lingered, a constant reminder of the vulnerability of colonial ambition in the face of nature's unrelenting force. For decades after the explosion, the ruins of Krakatoa remained a silent monument. The waters above the submerged caldera boiled occasionally, a reminder that beneath the surface the earth was still restless. Fishermen in the Sunda Strait learned to live with the knowledge that the mountain was not gone, only sleeping. In the decades that followed, seismic tremors and occasional underwater activity hinted at what lay ahead. Then, in December 1927, the silence broke. From the depths of the caldera, a new volcanic cone emerged, pushing through the waves of the Sunda Strait. It was small at first, a black, steaming island of ash and rock rising where once the great mountain had stood. The world called it Anak Krakatoa, child of Krakatoa. This new volcano was not a curiosity, but a continuation. Scientists and locals alike recognized that Krakatoa had not died in 1883, it had only been reborn. Anak Krakatoa grew steadily, erupting frequently in the decades that followed. Each eruption added new layers of rock and ash, building the cone higher, expanding the island bit by bit. What had been a name etched into history books as a disaster became once again a living presence in the Sunda Strait, growing before the eyes of those who passed by its shores. The Dutch, and later Indonesian authorities, watched carefully. Scholars and geologists made their way to the site, documenting its activity, measuring its growth, and studying the relentless processes of renewal. The re-emergence of Anak Krakatoa was more than geological, it was symbolic. For the survivors of the 1883 catastrophe and their descendants, the sight of a new volcano rising from the sea was both a reminder of tragedy and a warning of the future. The Sunda Strait had not been returned to safety. It had become the permanent home of a restless force. Eruptions from Anak Krakatoa sent ash plumes into the sky, disrupted shipping once again, and occasionally triggered local tsunamis. In 1928, only a year after it first appeared, part of its flank collapsed into the sea, creating waves that struck nearby coasts. Decades later, Anak Krakatoa continued to erupt, each event drawing the world's attention back to the memory of 1883. The colonial world of the late 19th century, with its charts, shipping routes, and economic ambitions, had been forced to reckon with the fragility of human order when faced with volcanic fury. Yet the legacy of Krakatoa did not remain frozen in that moment. With Anak Krakatoa's birth, the catastrophe became an ongoing narrative, one that spanned generations. It linked the vanished island to its successor, tying the fate of the region permanently to volcanic activity. The Sunda Strait, where two-thirds of Krakatoa had been obliterated, became once again a place defined not just by trade and empire, but by the constant threat of natural upheaval. The story of Krakatoa's aftermath was not one of closure, but of continuation. Silence had followed the eruption, but silence in volcanic history is only a pause. From devastation emerged renewal, not in the form of recovery for lost towns or erased coastlines, but in the rise of a new volcanic child. Its presence is a living monument to the day in 1883 when the world shook, and its continued eruptions serve as unending reminders that the catastrophe was not an event locked in the past. It was the beginning of a cycle still unfolding beneath the waters of the Sunda Strait. On the morning of August 27, 1883, the world was forced to recognize that nature could strike with a force so vast that its consequences stretched far beyond any coastline. The eruption of Krakatoa was not merely a regional calamity. It was a planetary event, a single volcanic outburst that became one of the most important case studies in the history of science. For the first time, human observers, armed with telegraphs, newspapers, and expanding scientific networks, documented the birth of global catastrophe in near real time. The lessons that emerged from this disaster shaped the future of volcanology, the study of tsunamis, and the way humanity understands its fragility against the Earth's shifting crust. The scientific community of the late 19th century had no precedent for what they were about to witness. Volcanology as a discipline was still in its infancy, scattered across reports of eruptions in Italy, Iceland, or the Caribbean. Tsunami science was rudimentary, often based on local chronicles rather than systematic analysis. Krakatoa changed that. When the caldera collapsed on August 27th, sending waves racing across the Indian Ocean, the physical mechanisms of how volcanic explosions could trigger tsunamis suddenly became clearer. Observers along the coasts of Java and Sumatra described seas rising without warning, surging inland, sweeping entire towns into oblivion. Waves reached 40 meters in height, confirmed later through measurement of debris lines and destroyed vegetation. Scientists pieced together how underwater landslides, collapsing magma chambers, and pressure waves combined to unleash walls of water. The eruption forced the scientific world to connect volcanic activity with hydrodynamic catastrophe on a scale never before calculated. Equally transformative was the realization that Krakatoa's effects extended far beyond Indonesia. The ash cloud launched 50 miles into the stratosphere circled the globe. It was the first event that revealed the true scale of atmospheric interconnectedness. By September 1883, blood-red sunsets, blue moons, and brilliant twilights were being recorded not just in Asia, but across Europe, North America, and even Africa. In London, artists and scientists debated whether the fiery skies seen over the Thames were remnants of Krakatoa's blast. The painter William Ashcroft filled sketchbooks with hundreds of twilight studies, capturing the atmospheric veil produced by volcanic dust. Newspapers in New York and Paris carried reports of strange sunsets, bewildering the public, yet giving scientists invaluable observational data. The world was, for the first time, united under a single natural phenomenon, an atmospheric canvas painted by an eruption thousands of miles away. Measurements followed quickly. Meteorologists in Europe and America noted unusual behavior in barometers. Pressure waves generated by the explosion had traveled around the Earth multiple times, recorded in increments at weather stations as far apart as Washington, D.C. and Vienna. It was as though the Earth's atmosphere itself had rung like a bell, resonating from a single, violent strike in the Sunda Strait. These barographic records became one of the earliest global data sets proving atmospheric wave propagation, laying groundwork for modern geophysics. Without intending to, Krakatoa had become the greatest experiment in natural science of its century. The impact extended into climatology. The following years brought unusual weather. Between 1883 and 1884, global temperatures dropped by an estimated 1.2 degrees Celsius, a decline large enough to alter harvests, disrupt monsoon cycles, and trigger unseasonal frosts in parts of the northern hemisphere. Ships navigating the oceans reported rafts of floating pumice, vast enough to endanger trade routes and force adjustments in colonial shipping schedules. The Dutch, who ruled the East Indies, found their maritime empire unsettled not only by death along their coasts, but by long-term interruptions to commerce. Krakatoa had not only ripped apart an island, it had reached into the balance of food, trade, and politics across continents. While scientists struggled to grasp the mechanisms, writers, artists, and local communities gave the disaster its cultural weight. In Europe, the eruption inspired literature that blurred science and awe. Newspapers competed to describe the sound heard around the world, the detonation that carried across 3,000 miles, to islands near Madagascar and to stations in Western Australia. In the villages closest to the volcano, oral traditions absorbed the catastrophe into folklore. Stories passed through generations in coastal Java and Sumatra spoke of gods angered, seas devouring the land, and mountains collapsing into the ocean. Memory was etched not just in charts and graphs, but in rituals, prayers, and cultural warnings that still carry meaning in the region today. Krakatoa also forced recognition of modern risk. Scientists began comparing it to past events such as the eruption of Tambora in 1815, which had caused the infamous year without a summer. Later, they used Krakatoa as a benchmark when Mount Pinatubo erupted in 1991, producing an almost identical cooling of global climate. Even in January 2022, when the Hunga Tungahunga Hapai volcano erupted in the Pacific, generating atmospheric shock waves recorded worldwide, the comparisons immediately turned back to Krakatoa. The framework for understanding planetary volcanic impacts had been written in 1883. The eruption showed that no corner of the world was isolated from such violence. The ash in the skies over Europe, the pumice choking shipping lanes in the Indian Ocean, the temperature fluctuations affecting American farms, all traced back to a single collapse in the Sunda Strait. This was no longer a remote tragedy confined to colonial reports. It was global, empirical, undeniable. Krakatoa became a warning etched into science, culture, and collective human awareness that the Earth, in its rawest moments, could shake the foundations of global stability in a matter of hours. And still, the echoes remain. This sound heard around the world, as it was called, was not just the shockwave of a volcano. It was the sound of humanity learning, abruptly, that it lived on a fragile, restless planet. The event remains a standard against which every volcanic disaster is measured, a reminder of both the limits of human knowledge and the necessity of expanding it. Krakatoa forced the world to measure, to record, to analyze, and to remember, not as a matter of curiosity, but as a matter of survival.